that consciousness must be fundamental. It must be the starting point of reality as opposed to the ending point of an evolution that created us. That experience showed me clearly that we are much more than I thought we were. So that experience essentially allowed me to see myself as the world that observes itself through my point of view. So I was a point of view of the world that observes itself with that point of view, which is, completely different than what was my sense of self. I perceive myself as a separate from the world, observing the world outside of me. And so I was certainly not the world. I was simply something other than the world. Now I am the world observing myself, and the world is love. The world is joy, is peace, is something that I never felt like that before. So how can I be not only the world, but a world that is so unbelievably familiar at some level, and yet so powerful and incredible? I saw basically it was a white scintillating light, and I understood that white scintillating light was the stuff of which everything is made. It was the first unitive experience that I had. I then understood for the first time what was meant for a spiritual experience. A spiritual experience is one that makes you be one, makes you feel, makes you live yourself as one with the world. So I am the world. I am one, but I'm also a viewpoint of one. So I'm a part, but also a whole.
I would like just to say that I will understand if what I'm talking about will be challenging for many people, especially with academic education, because it took me a long time to believe my own observations, that they're really challenging much of what we are teaching. So there's a general assumption that consciousness is somehow produced in the brain, and very few people understand that we have absolutely no proof that consciousness is coming from the brain. There are correlations between what's happening anatomically, physiologically, biochemically in the brain and states of consciousness. But that's really not a proof that consciousness is coming from the brain. So I'm not questioning the observations of the correlations, but I'm seriously questioning the conclusions that were made. We have a similar situation in the television, where the sound and the picture is correlated with what's happening with the circuits and the transistors and the specific elements in the TV set, but that's not a proof that the program is generated in the box. It still leaves the possibility that somehow the television set mediates the program, but the program is coming from somewhere else. So after all these years, I have now studied states of consciousness, particularly non-ordinary states of consciousness, over half a century, about 56 years. And I believe now that consciousness is a cosmic phenomenon, very much like Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, talk about anima mundi, the cosmic consciousness, and our individual psyche partakes somehow in this cosmic consciousness, and the boundary between us and the larger consciousness are really not absolute, they are negotiable. In these certain non-ordinary states we can transcend it and we can experience much more than what we have stored in our brain. If you mention this to somebody from the industrial civilization, they would say, what do you mean, wholeness? Aren't we already whole the way we experience ourselves? And I would say, no, we are experiencing only a small fraction of our real potential. And in Hinduism, they tell you we are not nama rupa We are not name and shape. We are not body ego. Our true identity is with the core, innerst the core of cosmic creative energy. They call it Atman. They give you procedures if you follow them, the yogas and so on. You can experience your full identity with that core. And when you have the experience of identification with Atman, you realize that this is identical with the cosmic creative energy. So Atman is Brahman. And so that's our true identity. And consciousness for me is a cosmic phenomenon.
Only late in life, although I've studied consciousness for 40 years, I've only come to these substances late in life, and they were very powerful experiences. And one, myself disappeared, my body disappeared, space disappeared, time disappeared, the perception of the flow of time disappeared. There was just a visual, there was bright light and terror and ecstasy. What it taught me, once again, the primacy of consciousness. There was no world, there's nothing physical anymore. Everything was just pure mental. But there was this mental thing. So consciousness is really central to our existence. I did have a fear of death because I don't like the thought of me being dead forever and ever and ever. And I've totally lost that fear since I had this experience in the first months of the pandemic. So it's a powerful but positive experience. And then I had this other experience, the reason why we're here. This was as part of a long ayahuasca ceremony. It's like 12 hours and you fast and you chant, you dance. It's part of Santo Daime, religious tradition, and where you come to the state where you access what your experiences are as mind at large, where you feel you are the universe. You are everything, and everything is you. There's no more distinction between you and the universe, and it's a thing of incredible beauty and transcendence. And then I try to understand now, what does it tell me? Right? What does it reveal? What does it tell me? And how can I fit this into my view of the physical and the mental? Because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to have a singular understanding of everything in the universe. And so that's why, I'm thinking, well, maybe maybe consciousness is really the only thing ultimately there is, which is a closer position to idealism than I used to be. The experience is, is real, it's more real. You feel, right, that you've come, finally, this is it. This is real reality. This is, I call it hyper-realization. This is what really is the case. Everything else is sort of a representation. It's a distant mirror, it's a distant image of the real thing. But now I see the real thing. Yeah. And then you try to use your intellect and my science, etc., to see, well, how can I fit this in? And one explanation would be a form of analytic idealism.
So most of my colleagues are saying, let's start with matter or neurons and say what properties of matter could create consciousness. But I'm saying that whole thing is out. Space-time is doomed. That whole thing is out. We need to look at consciousness qua consciousness. In other words, not as something that arises in space and time, but perhaps as something that creates space and time as a data structure. So what do we want? And here, again, there's no hard and fast rule, but what you as a scientist have to do is to pick what you think are the minimal assumptions that are going to allow you to boot up a comprehensive theory. That is the trick. I said that there are conscious experiences. Feeling of headache, the smell of garlic, experiencing the color red. So that's a primitive of a theory. And the reason I want few primitives, why? Because those are the miracles of the theory, right? The primitives, the assumptions of the theory are the things you're not going to explain. that's one place where I think that the mixed bag from spiritual traditions has something right. When they say, love your neighbor as yourself, that in some sense love is fundamental. I think that they're onto something very, very deep and profound. And every once in a while I can get a personal glimpse of that, especially when I'm in the space with no thought. Like when I can really let go of thoughts, I get little glimpses of a love in the sense that I'm not separate. It's a love in the sense that I'm not different from that.
Yeah.
If you and I are separate, then I can fight you. But if you and I are the same, if there's a union there,
the togetherness of it.
Yeah.
Who's God?
We tend to think of God as a being, but I think that that's not right. I think the closest way to think about God is being, period. Not a being, but being. The very ground of being itself is God. From my point of view, that's the ground of consciousness. So the ground of conscious being is what we might call God. But the word God has always been, for example, you don't believe the same God as my God, so I'm going to fight you. Or we'll have wars over, because the specific being that you call God is different from the being that I call God, and so we fight. Whereas if it's not a being, but just being, and you and I share being, then you and I are not separate, and there's no reason to fight. We're both part of that one being, and loving you is loving myself, because we're all part of that one being. The spiritual traditions that point to that, I think, are pointing in a very interesting direction, and that does seem to match with the mathematics of the conscious agent stuff that I've been working on as well. That it really fits with that, although that wasn't my goal.
I would imagine that you at one time were a materialist, and then you kind of transitioned to this. And then if so, how did that happen? What stuck out to you as like, oh, that's not right. I need to look for something else.
Well, I was a materialist, but an unthinking one. I never thought it through. I was educated since very early in an environment that breathed materialism as a sort of an assumption that nobody questioned. I went to university, I was just 17. And then my first job in life, 2 days after I defended my master thesis, was at CERN, the cathedral, the world cathedral of materialism. Not that CERN scientists are preoccupied with questions of being. They're not preoccupied with what nature is. What they want to know is how nature behaves. But they all sort of automatically assumed materialism, and so did I. And the way, what came up in my life that forced me to rethink it was my work on AI, because you're developing things and computers that are capable of solving very difficult problems better than physicists. So the thing you're doing is intelligent in any reasonable definition of intelligence. It can produce the solution to difficult problems. And then you ask yourself, well, what do I need to change or add to this intelligent silicon computer to make sure that not only does it process data intelligently, but that the data processing is accompanied by experience in the same way that what goes on in my brain is accompanied by experience. And then you sort of start facing a wall, and if you knock your head against that wall long enough, you realize that whatever you do with that computer, it will only change structure and function, and no change in structure or function will ever give you any more or any less reason to think that the computer is conscious or not conscious. These two domains are incommensurable. And then you realize that, hey, then if I'm facing an impossible contradiction of my way of thinking, where did my thinking go wrong? What assumption am I making that is leading me to this wall that I cannot pass? So you have to backtrack until you find the step that has led you down that alley that has no exit, that goes nowhere, and you make a different choice. And for me, the different choice was the assumption that I never questioned, that consciousness is something that can be created out of a non-conscious substrate, which is an assumption. All we ever have is consciousness. Whatever has never touched the field of consciousness might as well not exist, because even the world we see around us is a conscious experience of colors, melodies, flavors, textures, aromas, and so forth. Not to mention, our sadness, our elation, our happiness, our depression, and so on. So I realized that assumption ought to go, because it was arbitrary and it was the root of the problems I was facing. So I reversed the assumption, because any explanation of nature, any theory of what nature is, has to grant what we call an ontological primitive. You cannot explain one thing in terms of another forever. Otherwise, it never ends, or you go all the way around and then it becomes a circular explanation, which is obviously a logical fallacy. So at some point, you have to stop the chain of explanation and you have to say, well, this simply exists. And I will explain everything else in terms of it. But that last thing in the chain of explanation simply exists. You have to grant one free miracle, like Terence McKenna used to say. And for materialism, the ontological primitive are 17 quantum fields, which are not explained. You explain everything else in terms of the fields, and you just say, well, in those 17 fields, they just exist. It's what is there. I cannot explain them. I explain everything else in terms of them, but the fields are 17 free miracles. So I figured, well, everybody has to choose a free miracle. My free miracle will be consciousness. I will choose that there is a field of subjectivity underlying all nature, and I'll try to explain everything else in terms of that field. If I succeed, then I have a very neat, parsimonious way to make sense of things that doesn't incur into the internal contradictions and insoluble problems of materialism. And lo and behold, it's quite easy to explain everything else in terms of a field of consciousness.